Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the National Priorities Project webinar on the President's Budget 2016. I'm Lindsay Koshgarian, and I'm the Research Director with National Priorities Project. I'm going to go over a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So as you may have heard the announcement, this webinar is being recorded. Participants are muted, so you should be able to go ahead and make all the noise you want and not disturb the rest of us and or the recording. A couple of pieces of information. I don't see anyone who seems to have video active, but it is a possibility that if you have a webcam, I could see you and other people could see you. So if you like, please go to your bottom left and look for a little video camera icon in the very bottom left corner. And you can click on that and you should get a little slash through it to tell you that you have your video turned off. The other piece of information you may want to know that looks like some have already found, down on the very bottom right, you should see a little turquoise box icon that looks like a spoken quote icon. That's where, if you have questions, please type them into the chat box in the questions, and we'll get to questions at the end. And or if you have technical difficulties, please enter those in that chat box as well. You should be seeing on your screen a slideshow for the President's Budget 2016. If you can't see that, please type a message into that chat box in the bottom right. And we're going to get started. So, as you know, this webinar is about the President's Budget proposal for fiscal year 2016. Fiscal year 2016 will start on October 1st of this year. So we have quite a ways to go before that and probably quite a budget process ahead of us. So first of all, what is the President's budget? It's a starting point for negotiations. It's not a binding legal document. It incorporates feedback from federal agencies who put together their own budget requests and submit them. And the President and the administration take those into account in putting the budget together. The fiscal year, as I mentioned, starts October 1st, 2015, and the process before that, to go over it very briefly, Congress is supposed to pass a series of 12 appropriations bills that together account for the federal discretionary budget, and I'll go over what that means a little bit more in just a minute. In practice, this has not happened in over 20 years. As you may all recall, this past December, Congress finally passed what was coined the Cromnibus, which was an omnibus or a total budget bill that funded the entire government, with one small exception for the Department of Homeland Security, whose funding will run out on Friday unless Congress takes action before that. So that's how the process is supposed to work. That's a little bit about how it has actually worked in recent years. But the President's budget is still an important document because it still gives, first of all, it gives the nation a clue into what the President would like the budget to look like. And it really does serve as sort of the opening bid in the budget negotiations for the year. And it's the chance for the federal agencies to give their input into what funding they would like to request. So to go over the very broad strokes of the President's budget for 2016, the President requested $4.1 trillion in total spending, which is 5% more than what was enacted for fiscal year 2015. He proposes $3.5 trillion in total revenue, which is 9% more than in fiscal 2015. But as you notice, that's less revenue than spending, which would end up with about a 2.5% deficit. And as we'll see a little bit later, a 2.5% deficit over recent decades is just about average. Some of the key proposals from the president's proposal: for education, the president proposed 2 free years of community college for students who stayed in good standing, and that proposal would cost approximately $60 billion over 10 years. The president again proposed his Preschool for All initiative that he's proposed in previous years as well. It has not so far been fully funded, although it has received some token funding last fiscal year, but that would cost $66 billion. For the military, the president has requested the highest Department of Defense base budget the country's ever seen. That's $534 billion. And that's higher even than when President Reagan was president. He was famous as a military supporter and hawk. So it would be the very highest that for the base budget that the Pentagon has ever received. Now, that does not include $51 billion in war funding, or what's known as overseas contingency operations. And that funding is really key because it has allowed the Pentagon to have another source of funds that aren't subject to some of the budget caps and what you've heard termed sequestration. On infrastructure, the president has requested new investments of $478 billion over 6 years. And the president has included a tax proposal in this as well. That includes things like closing capital gains loopholes, instituting a new fee on corporate excessive borrowing that would be designed to discourage risky borrowing. And together those, I'm sorry, that's a typo. Together those would introduce new revenue of $320 billion over 10 years, not 230. The president also proposed closing Social Security tax loopholes for high earners. That would bring in an additional $10 billion per year by the end of 10 years once it was fully phased in. He also proposed tax breaks, new tax breaks or increased tax breaks for childcare, for families with 2 earners, and a streamlining of higher education tax breaks that would result in more people being eligible for the American Opportunity Tax Credit, which is a tax credit for higher education expenses. Finally, the proposal would expand the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is the cashback program for low-income workers, and it would make more childless workers eligible for that credit, and it would also expand somewhat the eligibility at the outside age ranges for people in their early 20s and people over 65. So here, in a nutshell, is the president's $4.1 trillion in total spending. As you can see, the largest chunk is Social Security, unemployment, and labor, and that is driven by spending on Social Security benefits. What we'll go into during the rest of the presentation is separating these pie pieces out into what's called the mandatory and the discretionary budgets. And that's really meaningful because there are different funding sources for those different buckets of spending. There are different processes for how Congress can allocate spending for each of those. So it's a really meaningful distinction in addition to being kind of a technical distinction. The next piece is Medicare and health, which of course is driven by Medicare spending. And the next biggest piece is on the military. And as we go through the rest of the slides, we'll break some of these apart into some of their components and, as I mentioned, into the discretionary and mandatory spending buckets. So what is discretionary and mandatory? Well, mandatory spending is spending that depends on eligibility rules, and it depends on either permanent or multi-year authorization of funds. This is spending that a lot of times people describe as being on autopilot. It's things like Social Security, which doesn't get explicit spending limits from Congress each year, but instead operates based on its eligibility rules, which Congress does not set anew every year. And notably, a lot of this spending, and I'll stick with Social Security as the example because it's such a large piece of this spending, is funded by trust funds and by payroll taxes. And what that means is that Social Security has its own dedicated funding source, so that it's not particularly influenced by what happens in spending in other categories. So far, it does not contribute to the deficit because the Social Security Trust Fund has been so far, and will be for many years to come, adequate to fulfill the Social Security payments that are going out. So mandatory spending includes, like I said, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, which people also pay in for, retirement for federal employees, and some student loans. It includes some other things as well, but once you get to those things, they're really kind of small pieces of that pie. Now, discretionary spending is what's subject to the annual budget process. So when Congress debates their 12 appropriations bills, or doesn't debate their 12 appropriations bills over the course of the rest of this year until October, this is what they'll really be looking at. And discretionary spending is funded primarily by income taxes, both individual and corporate. So that money, that really is money that gets raised and spent year to year, and it contributes to the deficit. And that's where a lot of the current battles over spending have been, although certainly there are spending battles about Social Security as well. Discretionary spending includes spending on the defense and military, spending on education, transportation, housing, veterans benefits, science, and other categories that we'll see. So first, how much is mandatory and how much is discretionary spending from the total budget? So the total budget is almost 2/3 mandatory spending. And remember, that's the spending that's on autopilot. So that's not subject to the process that Congress is beginning right now. Discretionary spending is the spending that is subject to the process. So one of the very next steps in the process that we expect is different congressional budgets will come out. And at National Priorities Project, we will be putting out a comparison of the president's budget, the House budget, and the Congressional Progressive Caucus budget that we expect to see later in March. And those will all primarily, they may touch on mandatory spending, but those will all primarily deal with discretionary spending. And then, of course, the last smallest piece of the pie is about 7% of total federal spending goes toward paying interest on debt. And debt, of course, is the accumulation of all of our previous year deficits. Every year where we've spent more than we've brought in as a nation, that balance goes toward our national debt. And then we pay that off over time with interest. So interest on debt is about 7% of the expected budget in 2016. So here's the president's proposal for a mandatory spending budget. I won't spend a lot of time here because, as I said, this is not particularly subject to the budget process this year, but it's almost half for Social Security, unemployment, and labor, and that's driven by Social Security payments for retirement and for disability, as well as other smaller pieces of the Social Security program. The next biggest piece, with almost 40% of mandatory spending, is Medicare and health. And that's really the Medicare and Medicaid programs. Then there are pieces for food and agriculture, veterans benefits, transportation, and assorted other mandatory spending. Here's the discretionary budget. And you'll see that there are some of the same items here, although they're definitely rearranged. So veterans benefits, for instance, you'll see in both pies. There's a little bit more in mandatory spending, but there's almost as much here in discretionary spending for veterans benefits. Of course, the big blue pie piece over on the right is military spending. That includes the Department of Defense base budget, the Department of Defense war budget. It includes spending on nuclear weapons. It includes spending on international security assistance, which are payments to other militaries in other parts of the world. And that is about 54% of the president's proposed budget. Now that's holding just about steady in recent years. We've seen it at about 54 to 55% of discretionary spending. But 625 billion is still quite high even by those terms. And as I mentioned at the outset during the key proposals, about 534 billion of that is for the Department of Defense base budget, which would be the highest base budget that the Department of Defense has ever received after accounting for inflation. So 625 billion for military, about 74 billion for education. That's a slight increase over last year. Then housing and community, then veterans benefits, government, which means essentially government administration, energy and environment, international affairs, social security, unemployment, and labor. Because that's such a broad category, that doesn't include the social security payments that we know and think of, but it does include some other labor programs and related things. Science spending is about 31 billion, transportation spending is about 27, and food and agriculture is about 13. Now, here's a graph that shows you military discretionary spending compared to non-military discretionary spending over time. So this is that big blue military piece of the pie compared to everything else in the pie over time. And as you see, the blue line is military, and it's almost always higher than the yellow non-military line, with very rare exceptions. One very notable one is that 2009 Recovery Act spike that you see over on the right, where the yellow line quickly peaks up above the blue line and then falls back down. And that was the spending to recover from the recession. But now we're back to kind of the status quo of non-military spending being less than half of that budget pie, with about 530 billion for everything except military spending, and 625 billion on military spending proposed for 2016. So what is that military spending? Again, you see the big blue pie piece over on the left. That is the Department of Defense base budget, and that's the 534 billion that would be the highest base budget ever. The next piece is the Department of Defense war budget, which President Obama has asked for 51 billion for fiscal year 2016, compares to 64 billion that Congress funded for fiscal year 2015. The vast majority of that is spending dedicated for the war in Afghanistan, even though we are scheduled for drastic troop reductions over the course of the year. It's still holding steady in the multiple tens of billions for that budget. That's over 40 billion of this budget. That also includes $5.3 billion dedicated for the fight against ISIS, or the Islamic State. And includes other things as well. The big controversy about the war budget, or you see the acronym there, OCO, that's Overseas Contingency Operations, is that it's not subject to the budget caps that have cut federal spending in recent years that were put in place in 2011 by the Budget Control Act. And as a result, it's been a very tempting place for the Pentagon to shift funding for certain expenses that might really belong in the base budget. That includes things like keeping open overseas bases that may or may not be actually related to the current wars. It includes things like replacing and procuring equipment. And the argument for that is that the Pentagon is replacing equipment that it's used in the current wars using those funds, but there's no method of actually tracking that or ensuring that what they're buying was actually used in the current wars. And so, for instance, one thing the Pentagon requested this year was to fund some F-35 jet fighters using that fund. Well, an F-35 jet fighter has never seen battle anywhere. So that request was a clear instance of trying to shift what would normally be Department of Defense base funding into this other fund that isn't subject to budget caps, and essentially gives the Department of Defense an extra way to secure federal funding outside of limits that affect every other program. The next biggest thing is atomic energy defense activities. That is nuclear weapons programs in the Department of Energy. And that's proposed at $19.1 billion for 2016, which is an increase over 2015 funding levels. Finally, the last couple of pieces are international security assistance. Those are those payments to other militaries around the world at $13 billion, and other defense-related activities at $7 billion. So I keep referring to these budget caps that affect the defense base budget and all of the other discretionary programs, but not the war budget. Here's a little bit about that. So in 2011, of course, Congress enacted the Budget Control Act that set spending caps for years going forward. And if those caps were broken, then discretionary spending would be automatically brought back down to lower levels using across-the-board blind cuts called sequestration. Now, sequestration wasn't entirely blind, but by and large, it would just slash everything equally with no prioritization. So the president's proposed budget for 2016 goes right through those caps. We've seen those caps eased the last couple of years by this famous agreement between Senator Patty Murray and Congressman Paul Ryan that we had a couple of years ago. But that agreement only goes through fiscal year 2015. So now that we're talking about the budget for fiscal year 2016, those budget caps from the original law are back in play. So the president's budget breaks those budget caps by about $38 billion on the defense side and $37 billion for non-defense discretionary spending. And this is really going to lead to, at some point this year, a showdown where Congress either needs to act again to raise the caps or come up with a budget that adheres to those caps. And here you see a little snapshot of approximate caps for years. So the approximate cap for 2016 for defense is $523 billion. And the approximate cap for all other discretionary spending in the non-defense, that NDD stands for non-defense category, is about $493 billion. So the caps for the defense side are consistently higher than the caps for the non-defense side, even though defense also has this war or overseas contingency operations OCO budget that doesn't count toward the caps. And so when you hear that the president's budget blows through those caps by so much, you might think, well, he's really proposed a huge increase in spending. As I said at the outset, for the total federal spending, it's about 5%, about a 5% increase to $4.1 trillion. Now, looking just at the discretionary spending, here's how the president's proposed 2016 budget stacks up in different categories to the 2015 budget that Congress enacted through the Cromnibus in December. So blue bars are current law, that's the budget for this fiscal year, 2015, and yellow bars are what the president has proposed for 2016. So you see overall an increase for military, a slight increase for education, a slight increase for housing and community, a slight increase for veterans benefits, and in most other categories, it's even or below. And of course, as you go down the categories, when you're looking at increases or decreases, you're talking about smaller and smaller pieces of the total budget pie. So also when thinking about total spending levels and spending caps, it's worth looking at federal spending and revenue as a share of the U.S. economy. And excuse the typo, it's not ikumi. So we had, so as you can see, there are some notable spikes, like right around World War II, where that spending line spiked far, far above the revenue line. So this is a share of gross domestic product, or GDP, which is the measure of the United States economy. And in 2016, it's proposed that the president's budget would put government spending at about 21% of the US economy, and it would put government revenue at about 18.7 or 18 to 19% of the US economy. So that hasn't drastically changed over recent decades. Now, flipping away from spending to the revenue side, here are the sources of revenue proposed in the president's budget. It's $3.5 trillion in total revenue, and by far the biggest source, with 47% of that, or $1.6 trillion, is individual income taxes. The next biggest source is payroll taxes. So this is total revenue. Remember, payroll taxes are what shows up on your paycheck as FICA. It goes toward Social Security. It goes toward Medicare. Those funds really go into designated funds that are not used to fund discretionary spending, but into specific programs like Social Security and Medicare. But it is the next biggest source of all federal revenues. The next biggest source, coming in at only 13%, is corporate income taxes, which is projected at about $473 billion. And then there are smaller categories like excise taxes, customs and duties, and smaller pieces of the revenue pie after that. So taking payroll taxes out of the equation, since they go toward designated funds, looking at the other two biggest sources, individual and corporate income taxes, you can see that over time, while in the distant past, individual and corporate income taxes accounted for about the same amount of percentage of all total federal revenue, that has just grown over time to the point where now individual income taxes are almost half of total federal revenues, and corporate income taxes are only 13% of total federal revenues. And bringing it back to spending and revenue together, this is the United States annual budget deficit or surplus over time. And again, this is measured as a percent of the US economy, or a percent of gross domestic product. It's projected to be about 2.5% deficit in 2016. And that's right in line with really the average over the last 50 to 60 years. You see here this tremendous spike downward for World War II, where there was a very large deficit in relation to the economy. And then it comes back to small deficits most years, a few years of surplus, where that blue line goes over the zero line and where the government actually brought in more money than it spent. And then it's back to sort of these small deficits. The next big spike here, of course, is the Great Recession that we had just a few years ago. But by 2016, you see that blue line starting to come back to around 2 to 3%, which is pretty much average for the United States over the last 50 years. Now, finally, after seeing how we spend all of our money, here's a recent poll from January of this year from the Pew Research Center on what Americans said their top priorities for Obama and Congress were. Right now, terrorism is number one. If you looked at the same poll from the same time last year, the economy was number one, and terrorism didn't come in until quite a bit lower. So that's probably the impacts of the Islamic State and ISIS and recent events associated with that we're seeing there. But very high on the list, and these are much less volatile and much more consistently at the top of the list, our economy, the economy, jobs, education, Social Security. And so the reason we bring this up, with a National Priorities Project, we always look at the federal budget and see whether it's reflecting the priorities that Americans say they have for our country. Certainly the military spending is there, but looking in particular for the spending on the economy and jobs and education, those don't seem as represented in the spending pies as they seem in people's true priorities. So we always like to bring it back to that at the end. Finally, we have lots more information both about the president's budget and about what the United States actually spends, revenue sources, taxes, spending in various different issue areas like education, climate change, health, military and security, Social Security, and various other things on our website, which is nationalpriorities.org. If you do go to our website and look around, you may specifically want to check out the menu option called Data and Tools. That's where a lot of our interactive tools live, including things like your tax receipt, where you can go and either plug in the dollar amount of taxes that you pay or look at your state and get a receipt that tells you for that amount of tax payment for income taxes, what did you actually pay for, how much for military, how much for education, how much for healthcare, and so on. You can also do trade-offs there. So if you didn't like what you see in those pie charts, it lets you say, instead of spending that much on Department of Defense, for instance, I would rather spend it on Head Start slots, or I would rather take away the funding for selected federal programs and put it into some other selected federal program. And we have assorted other data tools there too that are quite fun to play with and give you a better sense of how the money is being spent and how you might like to see it spent. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. And I see we have a couple of questions here. In addition to, I just want to give folks another example of how to ask a question. So it's down in the bottom right. If you want to ask a question, there's a blue icon that is chat, and it looks like a little spoken bubble. And you can click on that and type a question in. Another thing you can do if you want to ask a question by speaking, you can, up in the upper right corner, there is a flag icon, and you can click on that and we will unmute you so that you can speak your question. So one question that we got are where Black Ops fall in all of this. Now, for those who don't know, Black Ops budgets there are certain budgets that are secret. And the answer to that is that at a very high level, the Black Ops budgets and secret budgets are things that are ostensibly secret for reasons of national security. So that would be related to a lot of CIA spending, potentially NSA spending, certainly Department of Defense spending. The short answer to that is that the high level numbers should include Black Ops spending. So when I say $534 billion for the Department of Defense, that would include secret or Black Ops spending. What we wouldn't be able to do is see what that spending was for. So this is actually a real issue with the Overseas Contingency Operations budget or the war budget. That budget that was $64 billion for this year and for which President Obama has asked for $51 billion for next year. As I mentioned, the vast majority of that has been designated as funding for the war in Afghanistan, but a very large chunk of that is not itemized anywhere that we can see, and that's on the basis of a national security argument. or saying that, the Pentagon can't let us know how they're spending that money for national security reasons. So while that money is in the totals, we certainly are not able to see how it's being spent. And particularly with the overseas contingency operations or war budget, this is a concern because people have such real indications that that budget is being used to bolster the Pentagon base budget in ways that are outside of the normal political process and the normal budget caps that are affecting the entire rest of the discretionary budget. So when you put a bunch of that into a sort of a black ops bucket with no transparency, that's definitely a concern. We have another question about the president's proposal to close payroll tax loopholes for Social Security, to raise money for Social Security. And as I mentioned, that proposal is estimated that it would be able to raise about $10 billion per year by the time it was totally phased in at the end of 10 years. So the question is whether that money would go into the Social Security Trust Fund, and the answer to that is absolutely. That's where it would go. So the Social Security Trust Fund right now was established as a pool of money from which Social Security benefits could be paid. Right now, the Social Security Trust Fund has a positive balance, but in very recent years, the United States has moved from being able to pay Social Security benefits using current Social Security payroll taxes, so a model where current workers pay for current retirees. And as the number of retirees has grown, we've moved into having to dip into our trust fund to pay those benefits. Now, the trust fund right now is still in good shape. This year, it's in good shape. There is a positive balance. And the Social Security program will be able to pay all of its scheduled benefits using the current payroll taxes and the trust fund until the year 2033. So there are almost 20 years left. After that, using its current revenues and the trust fund, it'll be able to pay a little over 70% of scheduled benefits until 2088. So while after 2033, there would be small changes needed to the program to continue to make it self-sufficient, at the moment, it is still self-sufficient. Another part of that question was about what are the specific loopholes that the president wants to close for the Social Security tax, for Social Security taxes. So there are some, in existing law, there are Social Security. The existing law is that you pay a designated percentage of your income for Social Security tax into the trust fund up until a total income limit that's around $120,000 a year. After that, on your additional income over that amount, you no longer pay the Social Security tax. So what the president has proposed is to eliminate sort of a loophole that allows people to pay even less in Social Security. And so there are loopholes where if you're sort of near the top of that, near that income limit where the Social Security tax phases out, you can avoid paying sort of a marginal amount over that. While it's fairly technical how that works, the Obama proposal would make sure that people would pay the entire amount of Social Security tax that they owe up to that income amount. Now, there are certainly other proposals out there that would actually raise that cap so that for people who earn more than about $120,000, they would also pay Social Security tax on those higher amounts of income. That is not what the president has proposed. He's only proposing making sure that people actually pay their full Social Security tax on the amount of income that is already subject to Social Security tax. We have another question about debt and deficit and how much of a priority that should be. Now, that is definitely something that is up for debate and is a very active topic of debate. I will say that, over the last few years, the deficit, when you look at polling of Americans' priorities, the deficit has fallen and is not as high of a priority for most Americans as it once was a few years ago. And then if you look, of course, at this graph, you see that at about 2.5% deficit, we're right about average. Now, of course, the argument is that we can't have deficits forever. And there are lots of analogies made to people's personal budgets. But it's not really the same. For one thing, when the United States borrows, frequently we're borrowing from ourselves. So the United States government issues bonds or similar where United States citizens are actually loaning their government money. So if you have a United States savings bond, that's exactly what you're doing. You loan the government money, and then at the end of, if it's a 30-year bond, at the end of 30 years, you get your money back with interest. So it's different from household finances where you're not able to borrow from yourself. It's difficult to say what a healthy level of deficit is. Certainly, I think, there are no experts that argue that the 10% of the economy deficits that we had a few years ago would have been a good thing to continue indefinitely. But that said, there are certainly experts who say that running a larger deficit like that in times of extreme economic insecurity, like the recession that we had, or like the spike that you see around World War II, is an entirely reasonable thing to do. And in fact, there are, of course, arguments that it's a necessary thing to do, that government spending is the only possible source of stimulus for an economy during a time like that. And as far as what level of debt is healthy, that's a very complicated question. But certainly the president's budget that we have now looks to narrow deficits and to make the debt less than what it was projected to be if we kind of went on autopilot with the current system that we have. Of course, any argument about debt and deficit immediately goes to an argument about both spending and revenue. You can spend as much as you want if you also, without having a deficit, if you also raise revenue. But those are very tricky propositions. I see a question about Social Security being mandatory yet listed in the discretionary spending. I may have addressed this. This is mostly just because of the categories that the government uses to reflect their spending. So this 3% of the discretionary pie in purple up in the upper left that says Social Security, unemployment, and labor. There are discretionary labor programs that fall into that piece. Also, some of Social Security, administering Social Security, falls under the discretionary budget, even though the payments that are made fall to people when they get a check in the mail from Social Security are under the mandatory budget. So there are some small pieces of spending that fall into that category. Others include things like the Workforce Investment Act and programs that are aimed to help train workers, educate workers, those labor programs, that last piece of Social Security, unemployment, and labor. So that's why there's a small piece of spending from Social Security, unemployment, and labor in the discretionary pie. So a question about where can we find the Pew Research poll on taxpayer spending priorities, which is a good question. I think we don't have a link here on this image. So I'll see if we can put one out through the chat feature. All right, I see a question about overseas humanitarian aid or foreign aid in the discretionary budget. So I'll go back to the discretionary budget pie. So international affairs includes both foreign aid in the sense of the humanitarian aid that the questioner is probably thinking of. It also includes things like the State Department budget, so it also includes diplomacy. When you look at foreign aid comes in two flavors. There's economic foreign aid and there's military foreign aid. And so humanitarian aid or falls under the economic aid category. And it's things like programs like the Millennium Challenge Corporation, some of the United States' recent initiatives to address HIV/AIDS in the rest of the world, things like microfinance loans for local people in other countries, training of local officials, certainly health programs, global health programs, things like the United States malaria programs, et cetera. So all of that falls under international assistance, which is part of international affairs. And the piece of that international affairs, that's 4% of the budget, of the discretionary budget. And as a percentage of the US total budget, foreign aid is about 1%. So we have a question about overall communications and message points that NPP feels is most beneficial in terms of educating the public. Certainly at NPP, we focus a lot on helping people understand the budget process. So for instance, helping people understand that this is a proposal from the president. This is not necessarily what will come to pass. That this process of determining the budget will be going on for some months to come, and that there is an opportunity for them to influence that process to the extent that they want to by contacting their legislators and letting them know if what they see here is something they like or if what they see here is something they don't like. That's a big part of it. And also, there have been polls that I don't have my fingers at my fingertips right now that show that people really don't have a lot of understanding of where their tax money goes and what the government actually pays for. So, for instance, people may have opinions on spending more or less on military spending, but they don't actually know how much we spend on the military or on defense currently. So a big part of NPP's message is just to get the information out there so that people, first of all, know what's happening, what our government is talking about doing next, and that they have a chance to really influence that process. The question about specific numbers for drones and drone warfare. The Pentagon does release its budget request each year, and that includes often figures for usually procurement and or research and development for specific weapons systems. That includes drones. I'm not aware of any estimates that tell us how much is spent in the operation of those drones, and I would imagine that that's probably not something that the Pentagon is eager to let us know. But I can tell you that we do have some numbers on what the Pentagon has requested in past years for some of these weapons systems, and I'm just trying to pull that up right now. So in 2014, the Pentagon received a little over $1 billion for Predator and Reaper drones. Another question about Ebola relief and spending for National Guard and hospitals. That would fall under international affairs. To the extent that it was funded out of the Department of Defense budget, there may be pieces of that that would fall in Department of Defense, but that's been such a small amount of money. I think our last estimate, which is certainly low because it was some months ago, but was about $300 million. So it would be a tiny piece of that. I think the vast majority of that would be under international assistance. A question about the Congressional Progressive Caucus budget. The Congressional Progressive Caucus has not released their 2016 budget yet. We're expecting to see it in mid-March. And once they do release it, we will be doing a comparison with the president's budget and with the budget that the House releases, which we're also expecting to see in mid-March. So we hope to have that information in a couple of weeks. We do have last year's comparison on our website, which was called Competing Visions, and we'll be doing an update of that this year once those other budgets are available. Another question about tax loopholes and the fact that tax breaks in 2013 were greater than the entire discretionary budget. This is very true. Tax breaks in 2013 did amount to more than the entire discretionary budget for the United States. Now, that's a surprising fact for some people. We have on our website, if you look at our website and look at the Federal Budget 101 menu item and see where the money goes, in that section, there is a bar chart that shows that in 20 fiscal 2015, it was estimated, and this is an old estimate now, that tax breaks would total up to 1.2 trillion, while the discretionary budget was only 1.16 trillion. So they're about the same size, but we spend a little more to give tax breaks than we spend on all discretionary spending combined, including the military. Another question, individual taxes have stayed relatively the same and corporate went down. So there's a question about the shape of the corporate tax contribution during recent years. I'm going to click through to the individual and corporate tax graph that I think this question is talking about. So individual taxes are the blue line, corporate taxes are the yellow line. They did take a plunge right around 2009 and then have gradually come back. And the question asks if that's due to laws or business bringing back business. It's less to bringing back business, and I think just a function of the economy overall. You do see a similar plunge in blue plunge above an individual income tax line. For both individuals and corporations, I think that's largely due to the fact that income and profits went down during the recession. And as they've started to bounce back, as people and corporations have more income, they're also paying more taxes on that income. Looking to see if other questions are coming in. Looks like that may be the end of questions, and we are at 1 hour. So we're going to conclude the webinar. Thank you everyone for participating. I hope this information was helpful. We will be putting this webinar recording and the slides through that recording up on our website shortly for anyone who wants to access those again. We should have that information up hopefully within a few days. I'm sharing the link, which I shared with hopefully I tried to share with the person who requested it, the link to that Pew poll of Americans' priorities, sharing with the entire group over in the chat window that if you don't have open, again, you can access through the little chat icon on the bottom right of your screen. And I hope you'll all come back to our website to look back at the webinar materials and or to poke around at all the other great information we have. And we'll have more to come in the next few weeks as we ramp up for our competing visions, showing the House and Congressional Progressive Caucus budgets compared to the President's budget. And as we roll out our tax day materials for 2014 and other good things that we have coming up as well. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.